Hello and welcome to Tiski Sour. If you've been following social media at all today, you will know it is a very special day for us. It is the first day of our month-long sub-raiser. As regular viewers of Tiski Sour, you'll know we're a big crew. There's about 20 of us. Most of the work that goes into Novara Media is voluntary, and we want to start paying ourselves a living wage for some of the work we do. That will mean we are able to put content out more often, more consistently.
The aim is daily, nightly, and ever so rightly, isn't it? That we want to start doing some daily
Ultimately,
shows.
yeah, short-term plans are for 3 nights a week. Every night. I mean, Sunday night, that might be 3 years' time. We'll have to, you have to donate some serious cash for that. But I think if this fundraiser goes to plan, we will get to about 3 nights a week.
Mm-hmm. So can I have Ash Wednesday?
Yeah, we're going to give you Ash Wednesday, right?
Yes.
What are we suggesting? How much are we suggesting they give, Ash?
We're suggesting that you donate the equivalent of an hour of your wage every month, and then hopefully we'll be able to pay ourselves at least for 1 day per month. But that's obviously not a reflection of how often we'll be working on Novara. Right now, we work most days on Novara, really, without getting paid for it. We will continue to do so. Just this time, we'll be able to buy ourselves fancy things like food.
We love it, but we are broke. So please share with your friends. Tweet about it. Donate. Maybe some of you already do. That's
if you're
fabulous.
good at identity theft, all the ill-gotten
Yeah.
gains,
We don't.
send it our
we don't
way.
check the source of your cash. So you could even launder it. If you want to launder cash, well, laundering it, you'd have to get it back. You're not going to get it back. If you want to donate stolen cash,
What's
are you allowed to
money
legally encourage
laundering?
that? You're the lawyer.
This
is a great intro. I'm going to
I
introduce
was like, you're
our special guest
close to the line
today, Salma Karmi-Ayyoub, who is a Palestinian barrister, and you work in human rights law.
Correct.
And
All correct.
is it legal to ask
For people to donate stolen money.
Yeah, or just to say you're happy to accept it?
Well, if you said that and then someone did donate you that stolen money,
Yeah.
you'd be in big trouble
Because
you'd
also
you'd probably be considered as having procured that stolen money.
Okay, so we have
See
to...
what I mean?
Is there...
I reckon you probably need a follow-up action in this kind of thing for it to become illegal.
Okay.
In
See what I mean?
English
Don't tell us, eh?
judicial system, is there a bant's get-out clause? So if you were just joshing around,
Yeah.
that you'll get let off the hook.
Yeah,
Do
of
we
course.
have that legal precedent?
Yes, yeah. They don't really say it in those so many words. It's not like the defence of just messing around, but yeah.
the Lowell's defence,
obviously,
right?
you look at context. If it's clearly a joke, then it's a joke.
That was only half a joke.
It's a
A joke.
Yeah, what if it was true but light-hearted?
But if you have like some kind of special wink or something that you give people
Like,
to make it real.
Yeah, wherever it comes from. If you didn't earn it, actually, because we say equivalent of 1 hour's
of
1
your-
hour's work a month. But if you just came into loads of cash, you could
Then
have got
give it all to
you could have
us.
got a lot of it in a single hour, and we could go far with that. We're going to move on to the actual topic of the show, which is actually quite a bit less jovial than our introduction. We are talking about the defunding by the United States of UNRWA, which is the UNWRA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. This is the department of the UN which is responsible for the care of Palestinian refugees. And when I say the care, I mean the schools, the hospitals, kind of everything, right? In Gaza and the West Bank, and in, I think, also Jordan and some of the neighbouring countries where Palestinian refugees live. So on today is Monday, on Friday, the US announced that they would be withdrawing all of the funding they give to this agency, which is $350 million. So a cut to zero. This has been decried by the leaders of this refugee agency and by the Palestinian Authority as an attempt to ultimately disappear Palestinian refugees, which is why we gave the show the title we did today. Later on in the show, we're going to talk about issues closer to home, such as IHRA in the Labour Party. But first of all, I want to really hone down on what is going on in Palestine right now. So, Salma,
Yeah.
can you explain to me first the sort of practical significance of the United States withdrawing funding from UNRWA?
Well, it's potentially really devastating because the US is the largest donor to UNRWA. So without that funding, UNRWA is in a serious deficit. And what that means in practical sense is you mentioned that UNRWA provides food. It provides food aid, education, healthcare to basically 5 million refugees, some in the West Bank and Gaza, some in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. So you'd be looking, if they're not able to plug the funding gap, you'd be looking at a humanitarian crisis, essentially. I mean, even just one figure is, I think, 1.9 million Palestinians are dependent on food aid, or have food insecurity, and so UNRWA provides basic foodstuffs to them. You know, they don't have any other means of subsistence, really. So it would be a major, it would be catastrophic, like from a humanitarian perspective.
I mean, this seems to have gone hand in hand with a slew of other measures by the Trump administration in relation to Palestine. So you've got moving the embassy to Jerusalem, which was, you know, considered a huge provocation. There's also been the comments made by Nikki Haley, who is the US ambassador to the United Nations, who said that in any future peace talks that the right of return for Palestinian refugees, which I think we'll get into in some more detail, will be taken off the table. So what exactly is going on here?
Well, you know, I think it's fair to say it's a pretty dark moment in Palestinian history and for the Palestinian people generally. I think essentially what's going on is that Israel has seen an opportunity with the existence of the Trump administration, which actually within the Trump administration there are people who are, you know, sort of extremist Greater Israel ideologues.
What's Greater Israel? Just to clarify for our viewers.
So it's essentially the plan which exists, or the desire which exists, especially in the right of Israeli politics, for Israel to rule over and have sovereignty over the entirety of what was the territory of historic Palestine. So that's all the territory between the river and the sea, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. You've got now around Trump people like his Jared Kushner, you know, his son-in-law, Greenblatt, who are basically themselves pro-settlements. I mean, they actually fund the settlements, and they are ideologically like wedded to promoting these Israeli territorial ambitions. So what Trump is happy to do under the tutelage of these sorts of advisors that he has around him is essentially get to a stage where the Palestinians' aspirations, all of their national aspirations, are taken off the table. So we don't have a right of return for refugees. We don't have Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestinian, shared capital of an Israeli and Palestinian states. We don't have a Palestinian state anywhere on historic Palestinian territory. So that's kind of the broader context of what's going on.
I mean, Gary, would you be able to get the image up of the changing amount of Palestinian territory there is? We use this for our promo image, but I think it sets it out really starkly. Let's see what our heads of video can work for us. Because I think that when people talk, so here we've got this map, we've got Palestine as it was under the time of the British Mandate, 1946, then the UN plan. So here we see the partitioning of Palestine into, you know, what is meant to be the West Bank and Gaza. Then you've got 1967 borders, significantly smaller. You've got the Gaza Strip as that tiny bit edged onto the Mediterranean there, but you still have the West Bank as a cohesive block. And then 2012. So you can see that the West Bank isn't, well, it's not really a block in any meaningful sense. It's completely surrounded by Israeli-controlled roads and kind of inlets. Incredibly dispersed. I think that this is one of the best explanations for just what's going on. That was an image that I think Obama saw, and it shocked even him, and he wasn't
really?
He said that in an interview.
It's a very weird
recently.
story. It's like 4 years into his presidency, he was
didn't
shown this map
realise.
and it changed everything. And it's like, mate, come on.
Yeah.
I was like, are you telling me that you really didn't see it? But yeah, in terms of how stark it is.
I mean, it's a land grab. It's so simple. People often say the Israel-Palestine conflict is really complicated and it's been going on for decades and maybe even centuries. Sometimes people think of feuding factions. It's nothing like that at all. It's a very, very simple conflict, really, when you compare it to others. It's essentially about Israel having territorial ambitions over this chunk of land, this country you can call it's Palestine or Israel, it doesn't really matter. It was historically known as Palestine, and that's it. And the Palestinians are in the way. So Israel creepingly annexes or otherwise takes control of more and more Palestinian land. it tries as best as it can to displace as many Palestinian people off the land. And the ones that it can't get rid of, it just puts into these, what some South Africans actually have observed and call them Bantustans, which are just like these reserves almost for the natives, which are surrounded by Israeli settlements and Israeli manned roads and checkpoints. And that's how they manage the Palestinian population whilst retaining as much control over as much land as they possibly can.
I just want to focus down in a bit more detail on the politics of UNRWA, because that's sort of like the most recent development.
Yeah.
I think when I was first looking into it, I was a bit confused about what is a refugee camp in the context of Palestine, what is a refugee in the context of Palestine, and why is there still a refugee agency looking after millions of people? Well, it was in 1948, so 70 years after the original displacement. So, and I remember I was interviewing some Palestinians that were over from IHRA refugee camp. And when they were talking about this refugee camp, until I saw a video, I didn't really know what they were talking about, because I was like, normally you see a refugee camp and it's tents, right? Because you imagine that's something that's very short term.
Yeah.
But a refugee camp in the Palestinian context means something quite different, doesn't it? I wonder if you could just talk a bit about what the politics of being a Palestinian refugee and, well, UNRWA more broadly.
Yeah. Well, no, it's a great question. I mean, to start with, so in 1948, there was a war between Israel and some of the Arab nations. And in the course of that war, about 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly displaced by Zionist forces. And so there was obviously an immediate and pressing humanitarian issue, and they were, in fact, living in tents. You can see like these photos from 1949, 1950, and you've got these white tents that have been, put up in the desert, and people are literally there in their tents. Now, obviously, fast forward 70 years, people can't keep living in tents. But so what's happened instead is the refugee camps are essentially like makeshift. Some of them look a bit like shanty towns. Some of them look like just kind of poorer areas or suburbs of towns or cities, depending where you are. Some people are still living, though, in pretty bad conditions. So, for example, kind of shack-like structures, things with corrugated iron roofs. It depends on the country and on the camp. Very narrow kind of alleyways, very, very densely populated, sometimes open sewage running in the streets. And the reason, that's happened because, of course, people have had to build slightly more permanent structures to house themselves and their children decade after decade that they've remained a refugee population. So those are the 5 million refugees that are actually registered as UNRWA refugees living in those sorts of conditions. What you've got then is like an additional probably maybe 2 million Palestinians who are essentially more like exiles, you could say, or living in the diaspora. So they're people who, for whatever reason, maybe they were better off, they managed to get out of the camp and stop being kind of registered as refugee, and they live in Arab countries, or they might live in the West, and they have other citizenships, but they're still either people who were forcibly expelled from Palestine or they're their descendants. So it's... Yeah, so for example, my family falls into that latter category.
And so UNRWA they're a UN agency.
Yeah.
And they've primarily been funded by the United States. I mean, you could almost move back from Friday when America withdrew their funding to ask, why was America ever actually funding UNRWA and funding services for the Palestinians when you think of them as historically really ideologically aligned with Israel?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, the US wasn't ideologically aligned with Israel until really 1967, and the Israel-Arab War kind of changed the equation for the US, and the US started to see Israel as its strategic kind of partner. Before that, actually, US administrations were relatively sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, but I think it's part of a broader issue, which is that there's an international consensus that the Palestinian refugees are refugees, number one. Number two, they're the concern of the UN, because it's the UN General Assembly which, in a sense, took over from the League of Nations, which was before the UN, to deal with the Palestine question. So the Palestine has always had a kind of special status within the UN, hence the formation of a special UN agency just for the Palestine refugees. And the basic kind of consensus of the international community is this agency needs to be supported because, until there's a political solution, these are refugees and they need support. So I think a lot of these policies are historic policies. They reflect that international consensus, and you can have kind of overlaid on that additional pro-Israeli policies of the different administrations that come and go. But there are certain sort of almost have been red lines for this conflict until now, which the US has broken. Yeah. They've really departed from the norm and the established policy.
So let's talk about this notion of a greater Israel. So I've made no secret of what my feelings are around this politics. I've always been incredibly wary of the ideological position that calls itself a two-state solution when there's been no meaningful motion towards that, and you just have to look at the map to see that that's not the direction of Israeli policy in any sense. And what's known as a one-state solution, in which people talk about the kind of resurrection of historic Palestine in some ways, which is secular and multi-ethnic, multi-religious, is, I think, again, a bit of a misnomer, because the real so-called one-state solution that's playing out here is one of a greater Israel. And when you say that, people often dismiss you as conspiratorial or a crank, but I think that that's a grave misreading of what's at hand. So what is the effect in terms of Palestinians and their claiming of collective rights in terms of defunding UNWRA?
Yeah.
We talked about this a little bit.
So you mean sort of... So I think the US's kind of main beef with UNRWA, if I can put it that way, and Israel's. And when I say the US and Israel, I'm talking really, of course, of quite far-right administrations, is the fact that UNRWA keeps, in a sense, it doesn't on its own, but it contributes to keeping the Palestinian refugee cause alive, because it defines not only those people who are physically displaced from Palestine in 1948 as refugees, but also their descendants. Now, there's nothing strange about that. That's a normal practice in international refugee law. So the UNHRA, which is the High Commission for Refugees, does exactly the same thing in other conflict situations. So a displaced population are refugees, as are their descendants. But by doing that, of course, you have a situation where you keep alive this population of people who are bound by a common nationality, because they're all Palestinian refugees, and they all have a right to return in international law to the homes and lands from which they were displaced. And that is, in a sense, all of that happens because they're a collectivity. They're not just individual people who were displaced and then maybe can be naturalized in another state and just go about their business. So for US and for Israel's perspective, UNRWA keeps the refugee and the right of return demand that Palestinians have alive. And you've actually had Netanyahu saying this recently. He said, if we keep having the situation where the descendants of the displaced people continue to be termed refugees that have a right to return, this will degrade our, Jewish state project, essentially, which is Israel wants to be a state that's ethnically Jewish or has a majority of Jews living within it. And if you have this Palestinian non-Jewish population that just keeps growing and growing, who all have a right to return, clearly that demographically they're a threat to Israel's engineered Jewish majority status. And so that's really the issue, I think, with UNRWA and with the right of return more generally, is it goes to the heart of challenging Israel's status as a so-called Jewish state.
So I've got a couple of quotes which are directly relevant to that. So on Sunday, Benjamin Netanyahu described UNRWA as, I quote, the Refugee Perpetuation Agency. Yeah. And now the US, so this used to be a sort of idea that was resisted by the United States or by the Obama administration. But now the State Department is completely on board. And they described UNRWA on Friday. This was State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert. She said, UNRWA is endlessly and exponentially expanding community of entitled beneficiaries. So it's this idea that it's just creating a people. And I think one way, I don't know that much about Israel-Palestine history, but one way it looks to me is that what's happened over sort of like the past 30 odd years is Israel has changed facts on the ground to undermine a Palestinian territory. So sort of like the possibility of a coherent bit of land, which could become the Palestinian state. But because of the UN's mandate and because of sort of the potential of international condemnation, they haven't been able to dissolve the Palestinian people. But it looks to me that now they've got a far-right presidency who's saying, now's your chance. You've got the land, now let's dissolve the people. And that's what trying to delegitimize UNWRA seems to be about. That's in a way what the nation-state law seems to be about, which is to sort of like try and dissolve the rights of an Arab people to self-determination in that land.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's right. I think it's about dismantling any notion of collective national rights for the Palestinian people. So that you might concede that there were some people who were displaced and they might need a humanitarian sort of solution to their problem, but you're not conceding that there is such a thing as a Palestinian national group, which then has some sort of claim to self-determination on the same territory where Israel wants to claim its self-determination for quote-unquote Jews. And I'm saying quote-unquote because it's Israel's definition of Jews. Not all Jews feel that they have that right to self-determination or that they want to exercise it through a Jewish state in Palestine. But that's Israel's ambitions. And so you're right, there's been they've taken the opportunity of Trump's administration to push the most extremist agenda, which they used to previously have. It's always been there kind of in the wings, but it's never been possible to implement it because actually US administrations have stood in the way of that. They have kind of put some red lines down. But they see this opportunity to push through their ultimate objective, I think it was there from the start. I think it's a mistake to consider this as something completely out unexpected and sort of not in keeping with how the conflict has been until now. That's not true. This is just a natural, inevitable result of Zionist policies pushed through to their logical conclusion, essentially.
Well, I mean, could you have Zionism without expansionism? Because I mean, so sort of like a liberal Zionism would say, yeah, you're still going to have ethno-nationalism because that's intrinsic to the term, the idea that you have to have a Jewish majority state.
Yeah.
But they could have, as a liberal Zionist, you could have been less expansionary in terms of the land. Like you could be a Zionist and accept the 67 borders, and presumably, if they hadn't been so expansionist in terms of territory, realizable Palestinian state could have existed.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two issues with that. The first is that we have to remember that the settlement policy of settling the West Bank in particular and Gaza and having therefore these territorial ambitions has been the policy of all Israeli governments from the left and the right, including those that would class themselves as liberal Zionist governments. So that's the first point. And in fact, settlement expansion in the West Bank grew exponentially under the Rabin administration in the 90s, he was hailed as a great peacemaker. He signed the Oslo Accords with the Palestinians. These were meant to entail or result in a Palestinian state, and he actually expanded settlements even more than any of his predecessors.
And he was supposed to be the liberal Zionist.
Exactly. Right? So there's one issue, which is that there's a mismatch between what liberal Zionists say their position is and what they do in reality. I think the other thing, though, for the Palestinians is that unfortunately, liberal or illiberal Zionists, all of them do agree on the fact that the right of return for Palestinian refugees is a non-starter. Because even if you say, okay, liberal Zionists have fewer territorial ambitions, they just want an Israeli state in land that they captured in 1948, they still want to maintain a Jewish majority within those borders. And that means not allowing Palestinians to return and not conceding that there could be, for instance, a state of Israel which allowed for the expression of both Palestinian and Jewish self-determination. So that's always been their red line, no right of return. And for Palestinians, that's one of their most important demands.
I mean, so this is something which Joan Ryan, who is chair of Labour Friends of Israel, MP for Enfield North, wrote recently in a letter to Jeremy Corbyn, urging him to renege on his commitment to Palestinian right of return. And she said that because of the demographic shift that would entail, it is a fundamental denial of Jewish people's right to self-determination.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this because obviously this is, something which is coming up with the floated implementation, either in full or in part, of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition and examples of anti-Semitism, is this thing about, Jewish people's right to self-determination, and the example within that example, which is about the creation of a state of Israel being a racist endeavour. And I just can't get my head around the idea that as the left, we should be restricted from criticising the idea that there should be religious ethno-states in the world, that the boundaries of that are inherently racist, and rather than getting caught up in this a state of Israel, the state of Israel that people have been chucking around as a way to muddy the waters, that we can't look at the actual establishment of the state of Israel, its actual effects on the displacement of Palestinians, the eroding of their collective rights, the treating of Israeli Arabs as second-class citizens, and call that for what it is, which is a racist endeavour. So is there a strange sense in which the very hardline proponents of Zionism, both in Israel and the UK, are right when they say that respecting the right of return is a denial of Jewish people's right to self-determination and is an existential threat to Israel? Do you see what I'm getting at?
So you mean, are they sort of, in a sense, being more honest? Is that what you mean? Because they're saying...
Have they understood correctly the implications of the definition?
Exactly.
They're not morally right. But
no, but they're correct. They are correct. And that's the nub, that's the heart of the matter. And that's why, I always say there's lots of kind of noise around this IHRA definition, and different activists, some of them are Jewish, some of them aren't Jewish, have very strongly held views. But I always say, Israel... Look at what Israel says about all of this, because Israel really knows what it's talking about. So precisely, the issue for Israel, for I would say political Zionism, is that their conception is as follows. This is what the Zionist ideology basically says. It makes a few assertions. It says, number one, the Jewish people are a national group, basically. Therefore, they have self-determination rights. And number two, they have that self-determination right entails being able to create a quote-unquote Jewish state in Palestine. And clearly, something like the right of return, by which you would have lots of Palestinians return and then demographically perhaps outnumber the number of Jews, would hinder that ambition of a Jewish state in Palestine. And therefore, they assert that the right of Jewish self-determination is at odds with the right of return, and that somehow, therefore, the right of return is also anti-Semitic, because it would be anti-Semitic to oppose the Jewish right to self-determination. Now, the difficulty, as you can see, is there are several premises there that a lot of people would disagree with. Some people might disagree that Jews are a nation or a national group in that sense. I don't know, that's requires like a long kind of historical contextual analysis, and in a way we always say as Palestinians, that's not our business. It's not even our business to say Jews don't have a right to self-determination. If they feel they have a kind of right to self-determination, fair enough. Our business is who said that the right of self-determination should be exercised by creating a Jewish state on the land of Palestine, when that necessarily means creating a situation of an ethnic Jewish majority, and therefore necessarily means displacing the indigenous non-Jewish people, keeping them out, keeping them from returning, and the ones that are somehow that were left hanging on, subjugating them to some sort of regime of discrimination, racial discrimination or occupation. This is our issue. It's how that right to self-determination is exercised. So they're correct. So to go back to your question is, Israel or some kind of far-right Zionists are correct in their assessment that the right of return conflicts with the so-called right to Jewish self-determination. The problem is, it's how they're defining the right to Jewish self-determination. The problem is there, and that's what's contested, and that's what people need to be honest about, is like, if an exercise of self-determination by one group means the displacement and denial of those same rights to another group, there's something wrong with it, right? Something's not adding up, basically.
As someone, we can take... we're talking about IHRA and Labour now, so we can maybe take a sort of step back and look at how the debate has carried itself out, how it has taken place, and how has it looked to someone of Palestinian heritage, the way that the Labour Party has been debating the IHRA definition and the IHRA examples over the last year, 2 years, it seems endless. Sort of like, what have been your thoughts on a sort of general level of looking in and seeing this row explode and roll on?
I mean, honestly, it's been kind of obscene, I would say, for Palestinians to watch. And I think the reason is where I think all in a state of shock. And I've never experienced anything like this in my lifetime, whereby there seems to be a fully fledged political campaign to assert that denying, as we just talked about it now, denying the Jewish right to self-determination. In other words, what they really mean is denying that there should be an Israel, which is a majority Jewish state in Palestine, is a form of racism. So that's the assertion, that's anti-Semitic and therefore racist. And the fact that accusation is levelled, that you are being racist if you say you're opposed to Israel as it kind of in its current form, let's say. However, clearly what Israel is doing and all that it embodies, in our view as Palestinians, is deeply racist against us. So we, the victims of racism, are being painted as the perpetrators of racism, and the perpetrators are being painted as the victims. And there's just something really, really disconcerting about the fact that it doesn't seem like anyone's able to just call that out and just say that clearly. So instead that you've got the Labour Party under all this pressure, trying to kind of find all of these like a halfway house almost to sort of appease the Israel lobby, but sort of also not entirely renege on their principles. And it's just mental. From our perspective, we're like, this is completely, this is sort of mad.
I mean...
Can I just do one technical question and then I'll pass the floor? So you've talked about the idea that it said the creation of the State of Israel. It's racist to basically say you're not in favour of a State of Israel or the State of Israel. And there's this technical distinction that keeps coming up between a state and the state. So if I were to do a particular reading of IHRA, I'd say the reason they don't have to ask Palestinians about whether or not it's racist to say a State of Israel or the State of Israel is racist is because it's discussed in the abstract and therefore has nothing actually to do, or nothing necessarily at all to do, with the actual Israel that exists in historic Palestine. And we could be talking about talking about a completely different Israel. So you could say the Israel is a racist endeavour, but a Israel somewhere would not be. I mean, how would you respond? You've got a legal mind to that particular argument, which has been made by a lot of intelligent people.
Has it? Oh, it's good to know that some people... Yeah, so you're totally right. When you look at the detail of the text, so I think the difficulty with all of this is it operates on two different levels. You can adopt a sort of legal stance and say, I'm going to read this text and I'm going to read that specific example, and it says, denying the Jewish right to self-determination, e.g. by claiming a State of Israel is a racist endeavour, and therefore it's positing that the difficulty would only be anti-Semitic to say that the concept of creating a Jewish state is somehow wrong. And as you said, it doesn't make any assertion that you're not allowed to talk about the Israel that exists in real time in Palestine, on the territory of historic Palestine. The difficulty is, and so you can also, by the way, read the whole document, the whole IHRA document, and say, the definition at the top says it's basically anti-Semitism is hatred towards Jews, and therefore all the illustrative examples have to be read through that prism of hatred towards Jews. So all they're really saying is, if you deny Jewish self-determination because you're kind of being hostile towards Jews, that's anti-Semitic.
Jews are specific as an ethno-religious grouping in that they should never have self-determination, even though Kurds should and any other ethno-religious
Or if you if you want to say, a State of Israel, in other words, a Jewish state is a racist endeavour because Jews are not people and they're vermin and they don't deserve a state. That's clearly anti-Semitic. Yeah. So there's a legal reading where you can get quite pedantic about the words, and you can say, look, it doesn't actually intend to deny any of these sorts of criticisms. The difficulty is that there's another level to this, and the much more relevant level is the political one. It is not actually being used in that very specific technical sense. What's happening is people are adopting it. People aren't reading it that closely because it's badly worded and sometimes incoherent in places. It's
potentially intentionally badly worded?
Potentially, yeah.
That's what Stephen Sedley thinks, former judge.
Yeah, exactly. So it's open to all kinds of interpretations, including abusive interpretations. And the reason why in a way, the proof is in the fact that the Israel lobby is very, very upset with Labour for not adopting that particular example of denying a Jewish right to self-determination by claiming a state of Israel as a racist endeavour. The only reason they can be so exercised about it is precisely because they want it to be understood to mean you can't actually criticise the establishment of the Israel that we have in the Middle East. And that's how people are interpreting it already. That's how they're applying it. It's being used to shut down Palestinian solidarity already. So, it's, in a sense, it's an academic discussion, if you see what I mean.
Ash, I'm going to hand over.
I am very strongly against full adoption of IHRA. I think it is a disaster for the principle of freedom of expression. And like you said, look at how it's been implemented. Don't come to me with some nitpicking over the difference between A and the, when it's already been invoked in Barnet, for instance, to try and remove the council's ability to let groups that support BDS use their facilities. Don't talk to me about the difference between A and the when a Holocaust survivor had to change the wording of his talk, when Israel Apartheid Week event had to be cancelled, when an academic, because of an off-campus group invoking IHRA, was subject to an inquiry because of an article she'd written years before. It's clearly got incredibly chilling effects on freedom of expression. And what's more, I think it's completely self-defeating as an exercise against racism. So my investment in the Corbyn project, and I do feel very invested in its survival, because, I want the Foreign Office to be like, my bachelor pad. But other than that, the reason why I feel so invested in it is because I do genuinely think it can be a vehicle for anti-racism. That's the only reason why I participate in the left in the first place. I do not think that one can define racism out of existence, even a form of racism like anti-Semitism, which primarily is aimed at policing cultural distinctiveness and is embodied through metaphors, through tropes, through imagery, and so on and so forth. And it lacks that material dispossession element at this point in history that anti-black racism or Islamophobia has. So even though anti-Semitism is generally about things that you say, I don't think that a definition of it is the best way to go about fighting it. What's more, I think this particular definition, and this is something which was argued by Jeffrey Robertson, in emphasising hatred towards Jews, doesn't look at the other forms of hostility, prejudice, potential discrimination which can exist against Jewish people. So someone might say, I don't hate Jews. Why would I hate Jews? I just think they'd all be much happier in Israel. Why are they here? Right? And so under the IHRA definition, that wouldn't count, and that's obviously still a form of anti-Semitism. What's more is that you can only implement a code like IHRA if you don't have one for anyone else. Because let's say that tomorrow, at the NEC meeting, they go for full adoption of IHRA, but they go, look, we are open in principle to having codes for everyone else as well. So let's say we have a PIRA, right? A Palestinian IHRA. So does that mean that denial?
Word.
Yeah,
I'm
PIRA.
start using that.
Right? We demand PIRA.
Exactly.
Right? So say you've got a PIRA, and then you've got an example 7 to mirror example 7 in IHRA. Denial of the Palestinian right to self-determination will be considered anti-Palestinian racism and will be, subject to forms of censure and disciplinary in the party. That directly clashes. It directly clashes. You can't have equal treatment for two minority groups who in some ways have some contested needs because of the way in which this argument's been framed at the same time. IHRA necessitates a hierarchy of racism, and that should have no place on the left.
Okay, we're going to pick up on this point, but first of all, we're going to give ourselves a little break, and we're going to give you an advert. We used to do that on the Fix, but we haven't done them in a while. We have not got corporate sponsorship. It is an advert for ourselves. It is to try and encourage you to take part in the Novara Subraiser and become a subscriber.
In case you're sick of our faces.
It's a good video because it means actually that you get to meet a lot of the team that you don't normally see in front of the camera. So I think we'll see you in about 1 minute 20.
So the thing that I'm probably the most proud of is our climate justice focus, where we basically took the discussion around climate change out of the hands of toothless NGOs, and instead we reported on Indigenous struggle, and we made the socialist case for fossil fuel divestment.
Election sesh, that's just like a 12-hour live stream rave from the studio. I don't think any other news outlets really cover news like that. It's inclusive, it's not condescending, and it's a bit cheeky.
We're a team of volunteers going up against shady think tanks and Murdoch money and trying to change the conversation in the mainstream media. And thanks to our subscribers, we've been succeeding with just enough money coming in to keep the studio lights on.
But if things are really going to change for the better, we can't just interject in the conversation. We need to actually set the agenda. And that's why we're trying to push up our subscription so that we can pay everyone who works at Novara for at least 1 day a month.
We need your help if we're going to keep telling the stories that other outlets won't, and actually have a positive impact on the politics we're covering. There's a big world out there up for grabs, and we are in it to win it.
If you want a new media for a different politics to survive, to grow, to thrive, you know what to do. Smash that subscribe button.
So during that little ad break, we had a kind of interesting philosophical debate. I don't want to do it again, so I'm going to summarise really quickly, and then we're going to move on to you're going to give some more context about
The
the
white
IHRA
man's burden,
historically.
having to summarise what our debate was.
Oh, fuck off. I'm hosting, babe. You can have your own fucking Ash Wednesday if you organise it.
Right, go
So
on.
the idea was...
You need a Myra. Some protection
yeah,
for Michael.
please. Was that before Ash had said that Palestinian self-determination and Jewish self-determination are mutually exclusive, I was sort of questioning whether they are, because if you had a two-state solution, you would presumably be able to have self-determination for both. And the point that Ash responded to, which I think makes a lot of sense, is the thing that would be incompatible is the Palestinian right to return, as we've just discussed. And if we are making codes based on the consensus among a particular minority community, then that would come quite close to the top of the list if you were to ask Palestinians. So if you're making these codes based on primarily what any particular minority group themselves prioritizes, you're bound to have things which are incompatible with one another.
Because the sticking point is Palestinian self-determination in historic Palestine. Do you see what I mean? So the people and territory.
Yeah, well, the question, though, to be totally precise about it, although self-determination attaches to a people, so it's the people that have the right to self-determination, because of the way historically things have gone, international law only really accepts that a Palestinian state, self-determination by creating a Palestinian state, only exists on the territory of the West Bank and Gaza, right? Which is why Michael's right to say that technically they don't have to be incompatible, Jewish and Palestinian self-determination. But right of return, which you could argue is a form of expression of self-determination, Israeli proponents say that is incompatible with their rights. But there's been interesting work done on the fact that even if you were to say there is a Jewish self-determination right in the territory of historic Palestine, that could be expressed through the formation of, say, a binational state or a one democratic state, and expressed through Jewish citizens having a one man, one vote system. So there are lots of different ways to exercise self-determination. The idea that it has to be through a majority or wholly Jewish state in terms of its composition is Israel's assertion. It's not. There's no law that says that. And in fact, to the contrary, you'd have to find a way to resolve this. It would be all rights would have to be compatible with one another. So not the way I see it is to have an ethnically Jewish state in Palestine will always mean violating one of Palestinians' internationally recognised rights, be it self-determination or right of return or both.
I'm very happy to be corrected on this point. I have been convinced roundly.
Well, I think we've...
Well, I was kind of just elaborating on what you were saying.
Third world solidarity in action. But no, you have talked me around.
Can I tell you one thing that's just a bit funny as well, though?
Yeah, go on.
Just because you were saying about
I mean, please tell us something funny.
No.
We've
Well,
gone quite abstract here.
Okay.
It'd be lovely to have something funny.
Well, because I'm so sad, I find this funny. So when the IHRA thing was Brent Council was being lobbied hard by sort of pro-Israeli groups to adopt the IHRA definition. And that was fine. They were under a lot of pressure, decided to do it. At the same time, they came under a lot of pressure from Palestinian groups or pro-Palestinian groups saying, look, this is really problematic, especially the Jewish self-determination bit, because of the implications for right of return. And so I think they got themselves into a complete muddle. They tried to find a halfway house, and so Brent Council have actually now adopted the IHRA definition, but they've changed the wording slightly to say denying the Jewish or the Palestinian right to self-determination is a form of anti-Semitism, which I just think is hilarious. Because they kind of thought, oh God, we better throw something in about Palestinians to create some sort of equivalence.
It is anti-Semitic to deny
the Palestinian right to self-determination.
Well, there's a crank,
I like that.
You love it in Brent, if you're in Brent.
Yeah, well, there's a crank non sequitur that people make on Twitter that I don't think we should adopt in any way. It's completely stupid. But to say anti-Semitism can't exist because everyone from the Middle East is a Semite.
Yeah.
I don't advocate that argument whatsoever. I'm just saying that they would agree with this proposal by Brent Council.
My response is always, you have to use words
just use words as they're used,
generally used.
As they're generally understood.
You're not gonna achieve peace in the Middle East with some weird semantic trick because you read some old ass dictionary.
That sounds like clickbait. Like this this housewife discovered one crazy
definition. Can you expand a bit on sort of the context of the IHRA historically and what you were talking about?
It was just to say that although we're kind of very bogged down now in this particular sort of debate around the Labour Party and the IHRA, and whether or not these words mean what they mean, and whether or not this is even an effective definition of anti-Semitism, I think what we lose in all of that noise is the broader context, which is that Israel has actually been promoting what it calls the new anti-Semitism. And this is something that you actually see it in Israeli state propaganda from about the year 2001, which actually says explicitly that anti-Zionism is necessarily, by definition, a form of anti-Semitism. In other words, if you somehow oppose or you express ideas that are in opposition to the Zionist nature of the Israeli state, you are necessarily, in all circumstances, an anti-Semite. And that's been pushed by Israel for, like I said, about 15 years. And I think we're seeing the culmination of that pressure in the IHRA debate within the Labour Party now. So I only say that because I think it's important to always inject a dose of reality into this discussion. Like we can do a whole programme about whether the IHRA is a good definition of anti-Semitism. How do you tackle racism? How do you tackle anti-Semitism? And I'm all for that. I just don't think that this debate is actually about that. I think it's very much about Israel, an Israeli state-sponsored campaign of equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism and making it the case that you cannot dispute or challenge the legitimacy of the Israeli state as it is currently constituted, because to do so would make you necessarily an anti-Semite.
And for what it's worth, I don't think that states have got the same rights to exist as people do. One of the things that I get hit with an awful lot is like, well, do you believe in Israel's right to exist? And one of the things that I want to say as well, like, the state of Israel doesn't require my belief. It's not the Easter Bunny. It doesn't need my belief to sustain itself. So this idea that an existential threat is posed by questioning foundational premises, I think is complete bullshit. It's not as if, I go, well, I don't think Israel's got the right to exist. And Netanyahu goes, oh, well, now this one chick from Palmer's Green has said it, off we go. So I think that that's a completely non sequitur. But also, we question the rights of nation states to exist and in what form all the time. We question their rights in terms of, nationalist movements in Europe all the time. We question those rights in terms of demands of sovereignty. We question those rights in terms of conflict resolution all the time. So what's being demanded here is yet another form of exceptionalism to make systematic ethnic cleansing more palatable. There are two terrains on which the Israeli state is fighting. One is the territorial push, the land grab, the bombardments, the state violence, and then the other is the terrain of discussion. And that's something which I think all of us need to be incredibly alert to. I think that anti-Semitism needs to be fought tooth and nail, and if we had time, I'd go into detail about how 1492, the expulsion of the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, is pretty much the blueprint for all racism. So I'd be like, thanks guys, I couldn't have gotten here without you. You know, let's have a discussion about the centrality of anti-Semitism to the construction of whiteness, to the construction of Europe. You know, I don't think that that's a discussion that should be sidelined at all. But I think we do sideline it. I think we do perpetuate itself a form of anti-Semitism by this insistent focus on what Israel can and cannot do. We neglect Jews in the diaspora.
Well, you can also see how I'm about to go to questions, so type your questions now. But I'm going to talk for a bit while you're typing. So the point I was going to make is that this whole debate to me feels a bit like, what better strategic win could you have when you are occupying a people and oppressing those people than to transform the international debate, not about the character of that oppression, the character of that occupation, but into a really abstract debate about how you're allowed to define and how you're allowed to describe that occupation. So we've, in the Labour Party in the last year, I mean, in a period when Palestinian rights are being dramatically revoked, we've seen the deal of the century, that's what it's called, isn't it? So we've got a far-right government in the United States. At the same time, we've got a far-right government in Israel. And that's a very dangerous time, materially, physically, for Palestinians. And because we've brought Israel-Palestine into a debate about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, which potentially was necessary. I mean, you do see anti-Semitism on Twitter, but the fact that we've brought Israel-Palestine into it necessarily means that we're talking about semantics and we're talking about words, when really we should be talking about sanctions.
Yeah, I think it's like Miko Peled, who's an Israeli writer, has said, you know, people sort of, those who support Israel are very, very offended when Palestinians say we're experiencing Israeli apartheid or we're experiencing Israeli occupation. And they're offended by the use of those terms rather than being offended by the facts that give rise to one having to describe policies in that way. It's like, as you said exactly, so let's not talk about the fact that we have two separate laws for two people living in the same territory. Let's not talk about the fact that you've got children incarcerated in military jails. Let's talk about the fact that you shouldn't bring these facts to light, express them in a certain way, because that will offend people. It's that's why I say there's a level of obscenity to it from the Palestinian perspective. It's deeply, profoundly painful to see that our cause is being kind of shunted into a discussion, like you said, about what will and will not offend people, some of whom are the ones who are proponents of our oppression. I can't imagine a more kind of abusive paradigm. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's sort of, do you know, it's like the archetypal abusive thing you do. You victimize your victim and then you get offended by them claiming that they're being victimized.
Someone said an amazing thing to me I find it really illuminating on Twitter, where they'd said, I was saying something about Palestinian rights and they tweeted underneath, I can't believe you're defending the Palestinians. They're the most racist people in the world. And sort of I click on his link and he's linked to an article which is measuring like the new anti-Semitism in various countries. And the evidence for calling the Palestinians the most racist people in the world is that 93% of them think that Jews have disproportionate power. And considering they've been occupied by a state which calls itself the Jewish state, and where you get citizenship by being Jewish and you're excluded from citizenship by not being Jewish, and every soldier that is sort of demanding to check, you know, whether you've got a weapon or raiding your house is Jewish because they're from the Jewish, you know, it's not a coincidence. No one imposed that definition on it. And so because of that, because Palestinians think Jews have too much power, we're supposed to disown them as racist. As you say, it's topsy-turvy.
It's like this completely decontextualized discussion where in fact there may be some Palestinians who hold anti-Semitic views. It's true, but we have to understand the context in which those views arise and what is actually the significance of them. As you said, they're in a conflict right now, being oppressed on a daily basis by people who claim to do it in furtherance of their Jewishness in a way.
Well, they're on that side of the
yeah.
they're on that side of the oppressive relationship because of their ethnic state, because they're not Jewish, because that's why they can't get citizenship.
Yeah.
Should we go to questions or
Just really quickly,
Yeah.
that's why we have to engage in this discussion about anti-Semitism in a really rigorous and critical way. Because one of the things that I keep being told is that you have to back off from this discussion because who are you to say, as a non-Jew, who are you to say what is and what is not anti-Semitism or is perceived as anti-Semitism? And even from people on the left, frame it in terms of managing perceptions of anti-Semitism. And I think that's a really dangerous road to go down because claiming of victimhood is often how power can articulate itself, and that's not just in an Israeli context. We also see that in Muslim majority countries as well, and that's a way of holding on to particular forms of dominance, violence and exclusion. But also because we're in a very strange place if we are barred from making statements of fact because it will be perceived as anti-Semitic without having those extra characteristics of hostility towards Jews, prejudice towards Jews, or indeed hatred of Jews because they are Jewish. These are two things we need to keep in the frame all the time, right? That there is an accompanying set of emotional affects and intention that have to go alongside a statement of fact in order to make that statement of fact anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
And that's a discussion which all of us need to get involved in, whether you're Jewish or not.
Yeah.
I'm gonna be more disciplined in my role as questioning now. I'm not gonna try and answer the questions at the same time. So some questions from the audience. There's a lot about BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions. So to ask two of them specifically, what are musicians' role in this conflict, considering the BDS movement and recently Lana Del Rey's scheduled performance in Tel Aviv? And I'm going to roll that into a separate question, which is, what's your opinion on boycotting Israeli products and services?
I'm pro BDS. Absolutely pro BDS. What about you?
It's okay, so BDS, I think people need to understand what it is, and that's what they often don't. It was a call. So the BDS movement is a call that was issued by Palestinian civil society under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza in 2005, and it was essentially saying to the international community, we are at the end of the line in terms of how we can resist this oppression that we face. Please, will you use this, time-honoured, non-violent form of protest and pressure, which is boycotting things, consumer boycotts, cultural and academic boycotts, and push for divestment and sanctions as well in order to help support us in our struggle. That's what it's about. And so as a Palestinian, I support it because I support my own civil society. And I could never turn my back on, frankly, my brothers and sisters who are living in the most utterly brutal conditions when they've issued that call. Furthermore, so if you look at what BDS aspires to, it's firmly grounded in international law and in kind of values of human rights and universal values of freedom and democracy. So again, it's calling for the same Palestinian demands we've always been calling for: right of return, self-determination, and end to occupation. So in that sense, I only say that because I think people often misunderstand what BDS is, and they kind of imagine it kind of descends into some sort of row where it's like there's just some sort of very hostile Palestinians who don't want to have anything to do with Israel and are being very intransigent and very silly. It's not like that at all. It's about trying to use this tool of non-violent protest to try to affect change, and it's a measure of last resort. And so, in terms of musicians, did you say, is there a question?
Oh, there was a specific question about musicians and artists. So in
Their
the context
role.
of Lana Del Rey, who recently cancelled a gig in Israel.
right.
And she had a great statement. So she was cancelling her gig in Israel because she wasn't able to also do a gig in Palestine, which was a good way of putting it, I
precisely.
think.
And a lot of it, so the cultural boycott and the academic boycott is actually the bit that Israel is most vehemently opposed to, even more than the consumer boycott. And I think it's precisely because when you get artists like that cancelling their gigs, it treats Israel as a pariah, and that's exactly what Israel doesn't want. And what BDS is saying is, so the counter argument to BDS will often be, especially from Israeli friends of mine who are opposed to the occupation, but they say, look, this is a form of collective punishment. If you don't have these artists coming and they start shunning us and boycotting us, we're all paying the price as citizens. Even those of us who oppose are the government's policies. And the answer to that is, you're right, it does exact some cost. It is a blunt instrument. There is some unfairness to it. But it's an extreme measure you take in extreme circumstances, which is that unless you start applying this kind of pressure and until you start shunning Israel or treating it like a pariah and signalling, until cultural figures start signalling their disapproval of the state through actions like not going to perform there, you're not going to get change. So that's what I always say to kind of Israeli friends who are suffering. I sort of think about the greater objective here.
I have to disagree a little bit with this, because objectively, I mean, look, I don't know, maybe you really love Lana Del Rey, but I don't think you're suffering that much because she's not coming to play Tel Aviv. So the framing of this as collective punishment, I think, is particularly galling when you think about the forms of collective punishment which are exacted on Palestinians. These are two things of a completely different order. And yes, there is some kind of cost which you pay for participating and living in a state which is predicated on the violent oppression of an indigenous people. Yes, there is some drawback to that. It would be disgusting if there wasn't. I think that the cultural, the academic, sporting boycotts, these were very effective tools when it came to the anti-apartheid movement. Not because necessarily boycotts and divestment and sanctions were as economically crippling as the kind of, telling of the history has made it out to be, but because they were really important in psychologically disturbing the consensus in apartheid South Africa and, getting the majority of white people to think differently about what their position of economic and social privilege, political privilege was predicated on. So that's where it's important. My difference is, this kind of like, oh, we're suffering. I'm like, do you love Lana Del Rey that much? I don't love Lana Del Rey that much.
I like the remix versions.
You can still get those on SoundCloud.
She's all right.
I have to. I 100% agree with everything you said. I guess what I meant is, even if I were to take that argument at face value, even if you could categorise this as a form of collective punishment, which it isn't, it's still worth it because it's a very, very slight form of punishment, as you said. And it can't. The situation is unsustainable. Like you said, it would be grotesque to have people face no cost or consequence whatsoever to enjoying this privilege that they enjoy by exacting this price from from the Palestinians. So
you know who else respected BDS? Lionel Messi.
Oh really?
The GOAT for a reason.
I always had a thing for Cristiano Ronaldo even as someone who doesn't really know much about football. I always assumed he was the best one. There's just something about him that drew me to him. I don't know what it was.
It's the size of Cristiano. I mean, we're getting off topic, but it's the size of Cristiano Ronaldo's thighs. Because one time I had this very intense.
The whole package, babe.
I had a very intense dream about his thighs where I was clinging to them like a koala clings on like a tree branch.
That sounds terrifying.
No, it was great.
Yeah. Okay, so
off topic.
I'm going to ask there's two questions from people of Palestinian descent. So Dario Pomar has said, what's the youth's role as these events unravel? I'm of Palestinian descent and I know that many my age, 17, want to do something tangible. And we also have a question from Rami Yassir. As someone who is Palestinian and queer, my identities are often seen as mutually exclusive by Israel supporters. Where does pinkwashing leave queer Palestinians, both within Palestine and the diaspora? Two quite different questions, actually. Sorry to throw at you at the same time. But
well, I think the first question, it depends very much on where the person. He's 17. Is that?
He's 17, and in
and
the
his
UK,
name is
I think Dario Pomar.
Dario, yeah. Well, if you're living in, say, the UK, so you're in part of a diaspora community, then I hope, the responsibility on all of us is to first of all educate ourselves, to be able to advocate for our cause in a way that's responsible, in a way that's intelligent, nuanced, all of that, and get involved, if he wants to, in activism and supporting Palestine and all the different initiatives there are. And I think also, if possible, going to visit Palestine is really important. Keep up a connection with, as it were, the homeland. Go and meet people your own age there and spend time with them, because for Palestinians living under occupation, it's really nice to have people come from outside and know that you haven't been forgotten. In terms of the second question, the queer issue, it's a really good question. I mean, there are, sort of, I don't know if I would necessarily say a movement, that there certainly are queer people in Palestine, and there are certainly groups that want to see those two identities as totally reconcilable and not opposed to one another. And I guess the sort of queer people that I've met in Palestine who I admire the most are the ones who are precisely trying to use, let's say, their queer identity and their status in society, not as in isolation, fighting for, say, queer rights in isolation of the whole situation, but rather saying that it's part and parcel of their kind of resistance and of what it means to resist oppression more generally, so that it's more embedded, if you see what I mean, within Palestinian resistance more generally. I'm not saying it has to be, but I think there's a danger maybe with LGBT stuff, that if you look at that in isolation and you say, all I care about really are gay or queer rights and liberation in that sense, what does that mean for what does that mean if you are living in a country which has a broader struggle going on too? Because that could mean, in isolation, a Palestinian could say, well, I'd like to go and live in Tel Aviv because I'll be able to be freely express my sexual orientation there. Okay, but then what does that mean more broadly for Israel, for Palestine? So it's a tricky one. And I have to say, I feel out of my depth. with the question. But I suppose I would like to say that there are queer groups and there is activism on that front going on in Palestine, which people often overlook and don't realise exists.
I mean, there are also perhaps some useful analogues here when we look at the history of the Black Panther Party. So drawing connections between different kinds of liberation movement, Black Panthers called themselves explicitly an anti-colonial struggle, and there was also huge issues to do with toxic masculinity in the party, misogyny particularly directed at black women, and intense homophobia too. But women in the Black Panther Party realised that they were in a double bind. There's a phenomenal collection of essays called All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave, thinking about how you navigate this political subjectivity. Wow. And there was also LGB, I think less so T that I've read about, but certainly LGB activism within the Black Panther Party itself. Yeah. Because they recognised, look, we're getting, beaten up, chucked out of our homes and all the rest of it for being queer. But for the most part, what's killing black people globally, it's white supremacy. And so they had slogans like, an army of lovers cannot lose, all power to the people. There's a great photo of this graffiti. So you're having to bring these two things together, where you're able to look at the precise forms of violence that patriarchy subjects you to as a queer person, thinking about how they're accentuated by anti-colonial struggle as well. So you have this kind of, there's a microcosm of the conflict in the home and control of, gendered subjectivities, women, queer people, but the conflict out there, like that's the primary risk to your life, and you're having to navigate those two things. There are models, is what I'm saying. Yeah,
you're right. The thing is, the things have to be reconciled. Like that's the future, in my view. These kind of homophobic, chauvinistic kind of national liberation movements are just a thing of the past. They're not really even relevant to today's world and what people need and want and what they recognise to be their rights. But I just think, it just reminds me of something that, so Layla Khaled, who some people would consider a terrorist, others would consider her a freedom fighter, so Palestinian revolutionary, has said that she felt doubly privileged as a Palestinian and a woman, because it means she had two struggles that she had to always fight. So if you're queer and you're Palestinian and you're a woman, you've got three, and that's the reality of the situation. We all have to resist from the position we're actually in, and our liberation will be multifaceted and mean more than one thing depending on your situation and your position in society.
But I think you've grasped something, which is the difference between identity politics and liberation politics. Because I think when you get caught up in identity politics, these things become irreducible and collective action is impossible. The negotiation that goes into collective action is impossible. Whereas what you're saying is that, look, like, you have to start from the position that you're in, but that's not an irreducible position. You have to build out from it rather than chopping up the movement till all you have is yourself.
Said so much better than that's exactly what I meant. Thank you. You said it so much better than
guys.
We make such a good team.
That's exactly what I meant, but I didn't know how to say it.
Shall we wrap up?
We should wrap up.
It's stuffy in here, isn't it?
I'm sweaty.
Salma, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming in. I hope we have you back soon.
It was really interesting. Thank you. I'm like honoured to be here.
Yeah, no.
Honoured to have you.
Honoured to have you. Ash, always an honour to be in your presence. I never get bored of it.
You know what? Don't lie to
No, I never
my
get bored of it,
face.
seriously. Apart from when you told me to clean up today. But I got over it.
You're clearly not over it, Michael.
Well, yeah, it's fine. I mean, it wasn't even my mess, but what can you do, eh?
Your trousers were everywhere. It was like there's like a new pair of trousers or shorts like scattered over the room. Don't make me literally air our dirty laundry
I didn't
in public.
mean to bring up a domestic at the end of what I thought was actually a very productive and mind-expanding show. So apologies for that.
Turns out some differences are irreducible and the left will split.
No, it's not irreducible. Ash, you're right. I was wrong. I feel very ashamed. Please, if I'm suffering from all this shame, I'd at least want to be getting paid the living wage for it. So, in that spirit, it is the month of Novara Media's Subraiser. So please share our video. Tell all your friends about Novara Media. Share this video. Subscribe on YouTube. Follow us on Twitter. Follow us on Facebook. Share us on Facebook. Most importantly, go to support.novaramedia.com and please donate 1 hour's wage per month to Novara Media, and we will work all around the clock to bring you the news, the stories, the analysis that really matters. This was Tisky Sour. We are Novara Media, and we will see you in a week's time.
Bye.
Bye. Am I saying bye?
Yeah, say bye. Sorry, I should have said that at the beginning.
Carrie, cut!
So the thing that I'm probably the most proud of is our climate justice focus, where we basically took the discussion around climate change out of the hands of toothless NGOs, and instead we reported on Indigenous struggle, and we made the socialist case for fossil fuel divestment.
Election sesh, that's just like a 12-hour live stream rave from the studio. I don't think any other news outlets really cover news like that. It's inclusive, it's not condescending, and it's a bit cheeky.
We're a team of volunteers going up against shady think tanks and Murdoch money and trying to change the conversation in the mainstream media. And thanks to our subscribers, we've been succeeding with just enough money coming in to keep the studio lights on.
But if things are really going to change for the better, we can't just interject in the conversation. We need to actually set the agenda. And that's why we're trying to push up our subscription so that we can pay everyone who works at Novara for at least 1 day a month.
We need your help if we're going to keep telling the stories that other outlets won't, and actually have a positive impact on the politics we're covering. There's a big world out there up for grabs, and we are in it to win it.
If you want a new media for a different politics to survive, to grow, to thrive, you know what to do. Smash that subscribe button.